All right, so I'd like to take this opportunity to share just a little bit about another interesting incident in pre-revolutionary Vermont. Now, it's important to note that Vermont is full of these stories. These stories exist all over of disputes between New Hampshire grantsmen and New Yorkers. They are everywhere. And so I'd like to take this opportunity not only to share another interesting story, but to place it in context so that you can place some of the other stories in context. So the person I'd like to focus on is Remember Baker. Now you'll notice I'm using a silhouette of him in this image, in this slide. Remember Baker never sat for a portrait in his life. Keep in mind, having a portrait done of you, that was a very expensive thing. You needed to have some money to be able to commission an artist. And a lot of people, like Remember Baker, did not have means. And if they did have means, they weren't spending it on having likenesses painted of themselves. But Baker was from Roxbury, Connecticut. He was Ethan Allen and Seth Warner's first cousin, and he was a military veteran. He enlisted as a private in a company of provincial troops during the French and Indian War, what the rest of the world calls the 7 Years' War. And he was actually stationed at Fort William Henry near Lake George. And he participated in a lot of battles. Um, and he was actually known for his courage. In fact, he received honorable mention in the report of the commanding general, and he remained in service until about 1759. And he returned to Connecticut, where he married Desire Hurlburt. And they married in Roxbury, Connecticut in 1760. It was around this time that towns in the New Hampshire grants began trying to attract more settlers. And Remember Baker, his wife, and their young son relocated to what is now Arlington, Vermont, and they built a grist mill. There had been an offer of 50 acres to anyone who would come and build a mill. The mill still exists today, not the mill that Remember Baker and his family built. That one burnt around 1789, but a subsequent one was built on the same site in the 1790s and it still stands today. In fact, I'm going to go back very quickly, and if you see the background, that's the mill building right there. And the land grants that they settled on were New Hampshire land grants. And so they got swept up in the controversy that was going on during this time period. It did certainly help that their cousin was Ethan Allen, and he was heavily involved. But Remember Baker was made a captain of one of the companies of Green Mountain Boys. Um, he actually had a reputation of being incredibly hot-headed, and when you consider the company he was in fact, he was considered more hot-headed than Ethan Allen or Seth Warner were. Seth Warner was always known as being um, firm but sober, and I mean sober in temperament, um, where Ethan Allen was definitely a firebrand. He was heavily involved in a lot of the things that were going on that the Green Mountain Boys were a party to. So it is in this situation that another person shows up, and that is John Monroe. Now, John Monroe was a Scotch Irish settler from New York, and he was known as being a rather firm-handed, no-nonsense type of individual. And he was really favored by a lot of people in the New York side of things. And so he was made they called it a commission of the peace. It's basically like a justice of the peace today. And he received land near what is now Shaftesbury, Vermont. And he moved his family there, and he was really a small handful of New Yorkers in that area that supported and owed their loyalty to New York. And he actually did fairly well. He operated mills, he had a pottery, an ashery, which is where they processed wood ash into potash, a nail factory. But really, a lot of the New York authorities thought that by placing a man like John Monroe there would bring the Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys to heel, so to speak, over these disputes. They thought he was the type of person that could instill a little law and order in that case. So in 1771, the Green Mountain Boys descended upon the settlement of a Charles Hutchinson. And Charles Hutchinson was also a veteran of the French and Indian War. He had received land in what is now Rupert, Vermont, as payment. And because he owed his loyalty to New York, at this point, the Green Mountain Boys decided that they could not allow any New York settlers to put down roots in Vermont or in the New Hampshire grants, because there was fear that the more New York settlers that came, the more loyal to New York they would be, and the greater likelihood that New Hampshire settlers would be forced off their land and be disinherited, essentially. So the Green Mountain Boys raided Hutchinson's cabin, and they dragged Hutchinson out and they burned it to the ground. This incident is going to be covered later, but they burned it to the ground to the point and made Hutchinson watch. And supposedly, according to Hutchinson's deposition, Ethan Allen grabbed him and told him that he should go complain to the governor of New York and the state assembly of New York if he didn't like what was happening that day. Remember, Baker was there. He was one of the ringleaders of this incident. Reportedly, while Ethan Allen was saying his words, Remember Baker was holding a cudgel, which is a blunt stick, and was threatening Hutchinson with the cudgel with bodily harm. After this incident, all of these men had warrants issued for their arrest. Ethan Allen, um, several of the captains, and including Remember Baker, all had warrants issued for their arrest for this act of lawlessness. And so John Monroe, um, I don't know exactly if it was as a result of this warrant, but John Monroe decided he was going to enforce some of this. And so on March 21st, 1772, men from New York under Monroe attacked Baker's mill and they took Baker away as a prisoner. There were about 12 of them, and reportedly, Baker was asleep in the mill when they attacked it and fought back when they tried to enter. And there are a lot of conflicting reports, but one was that he fought back with an axe, and reportedly he lost one of his thumbs during this attack. Desire Baker, his wife, was also injured. She jumped out of a window and injured her arm. She never fully recovered use of this. And the party leaves to bring Baker back to Albany. So Monroe would report to the governor of New York that the conflict was in fact very desperate, and as they're bringing Baker back to Albany, the neighbors and a group of Green Mountain Boys found out what had happened, and they went to go recapture Remember Baker from this posse. Once Monroe heard that the posse was on its way, they just left Remember Baker behind in the woods. Just figure, like, because they didn't know how big the party was, they didn't know how outnumbered they were, and so they just decided, all right, leave him there. That way we can avoid a conflict. The very next day, Seth Warner and Justice Sherwood intercepted the Yorker party, and they were specifically after Remember Baker's musket. His gun had been confiscated the night before. They wanted it back. To leave a family on the frontier without a weapon was in those days considered just something that was untenable. Monroe, being who he was, attempted, because there was a warrant for Seth Warner at the time, he attempted to arrest Warner, and he did so by seizing the reins of Seth Warner's horse. And Warner apparently pulled his sword out of its scabbard and struck Monroe on the head with it. He did not use the sharpened edge, he used the flat of the blade, which, according to the accounts, uh, it it knocked him over. It did not damage him too badly because the hat and apparently Monroe's thick shock of hair provided some cushioning. Now, remember Baker would join Ethan Allen for the capture of Fort Ticonderoga in 1775. He and Seth Warner later went to Crown Point, and they acted as scouts for the remainder of for a lot of that campaign. Around August 19th, 1775, remember Baker went on a scouting expedition near Fort St. John, and they were attacked by British Allied natives, and remember Baker was killed. That was August 19th, 1775. Now, this is one incident, but when you combine this incident with a lot of other incidents that were going on, when you talk about what happened with Charles Hutchinson, we talk about what happened with James Breckinridge, you talk about the Westminster Massacre, you talk about a lot of incidents, you're really looking at a state of civil war during this time period. So, to bolster this argument a little bit, I wanted to talk about what a civil war is. And a civil war is defined as a violent conflict between the state and one or more organized non state actors in the state's territories. That's what kind of distinguishes it from, say, crime or something. And historians do not often apply the situation that was happening in Vermont as a civil war. But when you look at a lot of the people, I think that this was actually a very fair representation of what was going on in Vermont at the time. And so it begs the question, were the New Hampshire grants in a state of civil war? And in my opinion, they absolutely were. Because you look at the competing land claims, you had people loyal to separate factions. You had people loyal to the Green Mountain Boys or the New Hampshire grants. And then you had people loyal to New York, and you had those groups acting against each other. If you define it as a war against of the state against itself, this incident in particular stands out because Monroe had a commission. He had legal authority as a justice, as a judicial official to enforce a warrant and arrest. He had legal grounds, and an organized group opposed his legal grounds. You actually have the battles between the state and an organized government at play here. And so, really, this incident, and then you add the other incidents that come along, and I see that things were really in a state of civil war. Interestingly, the way the American Revolution is taught in other parts of the world, I've queried people from Great Britain before and said, how is the American Revolution is taught here? And it's generally taught as a civil war in the colonies between people who wanted to separate and people who wanted to stay loyal. If you take that perspective and apply it to Vermont, you'll see that it very much was true that the New Hampshire grants or Vermont was in a state of civil war in the years prior to the Revolution between warring factions, and a lot of people were caught up in the middle of it. Thank you.